Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Kepp, a co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values, and we're looking forward to hosting today's webinar. But before I do, I want to share something special we have for attendees of today's webinar. Our next monthly virtual conference is coming up on June 16th, and it's titled The New Benefits That Employees Need and Want Today. Thanks to our partners and today's sponsor, we have some complimentary VIP tickets available for those who've joined today's webinar. That's you. I'm putting a link in the chat space right now, which you can access with the button on the bottom of your screen. You'll want to take advantage of this one. The regular price for our conference tickets is $149, and this link will give you a free VIP ticket for the whole day's activities. And now on to today's webinar. We'll be exploring the topic of how small to medium enterprises are facing the back to work challenge. Human capital is at the heart of the value and differentiation that small and medium-sized enterprises deliver to their customers. While a lot has been written about what the return to work might look like for large corporations, there's been much less insight into helping small and mid-sized businesses navigate this journey to the post-pandemic era. To fill that void, the firm Works NYC partnered with PG Research to get some answers. While the focus of the research was on community banks and credit unions, the insights gathered are relevant for other small and medium-sized businesses as they develop and implement their return to work strategies. In this webinar, our expert speakers will talk about this segment's journey both before and during the pandemic and offer insights into how small and medium-sized businesses will grow and sustain as employees return to work. Those insights include how smaller enterprises can retain their culture and reframe the connection among employees while rethinking their approach to retention, recruitment, diversity, and inclusion. Also to be covered during today's conversation will be strategies for addressing workforce enablement, change management, work-life balance, especially for women and working mothers, and resource redeployment through reskilling and upskilling. Our sponsor today is Works NYC. I'll tell you a little bit about them. Works NYC is committed to working with companies to create talent strategies that expand access to coaching programs to more effectively develop employees' innate talents and champion diversity and inclusion. That commitment inspired the firm's study of how small to medium-sized enterprises are facing the back to work challenge. This webinar will share the findings from proprietary research designed to help these businesses design and implement strategies that leverage this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to transform their teams, accelerate diversity and inclusion, retain workplace culture, and recalibrate work-life balance, and all this while achieving long-term business growth. Now, a few quick logistical items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with the link. That email will also have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from the Society of Human Resource Management. And look out for a written account of the conversation soon on our website at fromday1.co. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Lydia Dishman, a contributing editor for Fast Company on such topics as tech and leadership, as well as breaking news. She's written for CBS Money Watch, Fortune, Popular Science, and the New York Times, among others. Okay, Lydia, over to you and our speakers.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I am sure we are going to have a great discussion and you're going to get a lot of valuable insights. But before I begin, I'd like to ask that we all take a moment to recognize that as we often talk about the sweeping changes ushered in by the pandemic, we also need to recognize another pivotal event that occurred a year ago today that changed everything. That's when a police officer kneeled on the neck of George Floyd, causing him to suffocate and die. So to honor his life and the lives of so many people of color who were killed, I'd like to ask that we just take a brief moment of silence. Thank you. Okay, on to the business at hand. I was glad to get a sneak preview of this report because it reinforced what I'm already starting to see. I've come across a number of studies from various organizations that suggest that the future of work is hybrid. Many employees want to return to the office, but only a few days a week, as they've come to value the time savings of not commuting. Who doesn't love that? And the flexibility that comes with being able to structure your own work days through asynchronous communication. Part of that impact has been that productivity has soared because people can now work within their own best times to get things done. But the downside of that is the very, very real danger of burnout. And what I would argue is a sort of disconnectivity because we're not face-to-face with each other. One thing I'd be remiss not to mention is the fact that we have to recognize that this is only among a segment of workers who can operate in this way, mostly knowledge workers. A large swath of the workforce still has to be on site. But of course, all of this brings both challenges and opportunities to reshape how work gets done. And since we're still in the early days of this grand experiment, not a whole lot has been written about best practices, much less for small and medium-sized organizations, which is why I'm pleased to be facilitating this session, which is centered on the findings, as Steve mentioned, of a new Coaching Works NYC report that was conducted in partnership with PG Research and Advisory Services. So one thing that I did come across was among the key findings is that most of the financial institutions plan to enable hybrid work environments. Here's the interesting part, which represents one of the most significant organizational restructurings in the market since the introduction of web-based and mobile banking. So this is a grand experiment indeed that requires rethinking everything from how to retain company culture while people are distributed between office and remote work, and reframing those connections, opportunities for recruiting new talent and retention. So as you can imagine, I have lots of questions, as is my wont, but I'll be sure to leave some time at the end for the audience to chime in and ask some questions of their own. But now I'd like to ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves, tell me a little bit about your work. Tom, can we start with you?
Thank you, Lydia. Hi, I'm Tom Pierce. I'm a Chief Marketing Officer for PSCU. We are the largest credit union service organization in the US, so we serve about 1,500 credit unions, primarily in debit and credit card processing, along with a lot of the solutions around that, including digital banking, fraud solutions, loyalty, and as well as contact center solutions. So I've been a part of our Return to Business 2.0 senior committee since the start of the pandemic, and we've seen a lot of evolution. Looking forward to talking about that today.
Awesome. Elbow deep in it. This is what we like to hear. Ben, we'll go to you next.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Ben Colvin, and I'm a recovering corporate executive. I'm now focused on leadership consulting and coaching. And my practice is really about bringing real-life scalable solutions to enhance existing talent management strategies. And that's mostly around bringing coaching deeper into the organization, mostly because I think that's what's really critical to helping accelerate diversity among leadership benches, but also to best prepare those leaders when they take over. But today, my main role is to provide some practical insights that you can deploy in support of the findings that we have from the research.
Great, thank you. Patty, coming to you next.
Great, thanks so much, Lydia. Hi, everybody. My name is Patty Hewitt. I'm also known as Payment Gal. That's my professional name. Hence, I am the owner of PG, which stands for Payment Gal. Just stay with me. You can follow this. PG Research and Advisory Services. So a big part of my business is partnering with organizations like Coaching Works. And I'm proud to say that Ben is also a former colleague of mine, and very happy to partner with him on this particular research. So I'm the author of the study and its lead analyst.
Great. Well, that leads into our first question, which is, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the design of the survey. And as Steve mentioned at the beginning, it was focused on community banks and credit unions, but what the relevance is to other small and medium-sized businesses.
Sure. This study is based on a qualitative survey. So it's based on one-to-one interviews. In this case, we interviewed executives across the value chain in small to medium-sized financial institutions, community banks, and credit unions, and the like. And much of what we found is true for other small and medium-sized enterprises, especially those that have at their core a differentiator in the way that they approach personal service. The fact that that service, that relevant personal service, is very much a key part of the way that they go to market. And I think in that case, the findings that we have for this segment are true for other segments that compete in that same way. So that's a little bit about the survey, Lydia.
Yeah, that's good context. And, you know, as I love to do, take the 30,000-foot view first. So we're going to come to Ben next, and we'll talk about the bigger takeaways from this.
Yeah, let me build. By the way, I'm driving as well, so as a New Yorker, I'm not a great driver, so bear with me.
You have to put one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake at all times, exactly. Almost as if you're driving a manual.
You know, it's a really important point, right? And Patty, building on that, you know, human capital is so core to the value and differentiators that so many SMEs bring. And it's the heart of delivering that is really the organizational culture. And we did find really that there were three components to that. The first one is around retaining the culture. And what I mean by that is change will best be managed through the preservation of the organization's cultural norms. And this includes integrating a flexible and remote mindset, because you're right, hybrid at some sort is probably going to be the makeup of all of these. So how do you retain culture in that new normal? The other one is around reframing connections. A conscious effort has to be required even more so now to ensure that the connections between employees as return to work takes on, whether it's a fully hybrid view, fully remote, or somewhere in between, that employees stay connected to each other, but also to their customers. And this includes reskilling managers around some soft skills. And then lastly, it's about rethinking retention and recruitment. And what I mean by that is workers have been untethered, right, from geographic boundaries during the COVID crisis. So this is both an opportunity and a risk. It creates new hiring opportunities to find those who are well aligned to the organization, but it could also create some competition for skilled workers depending on what your mindset is around location. So this can include upskilling employees so that you can redeploy them to help retain the culture that they're a part of. So that's a little bit about the sneak preview, and we'll talk more about it as we get into it.
Yeah, for sure. Again, I have lots of questions, and I keep hearing some of these themes come up over and over again in my reporting and also my editing work, that particularly the reskilling piece has to be both hard skill and soft skill, because empathy seemed to be the skill of choice over this past year.
That's
so
right.
Anyway, but talking about hard skills and this sort of sweeping digital transformation that occurred this past year, in particular in this segment of the market, that was happening actually before the pandemic. Is that right, Patty? So what did that look like, and how prepared was this industry for what came next?
Oh, you're on mute, Patty.
So the survey had three components, and the first part of the survey had to do with that pre-pandemic environment, as you mentioned, Lydia, where we already had actions in flight and there was change already in flight. But like most segments of the market, change happens in a more measured pace. So financial institutions, like a lot of organizations, were investing in IT in order to drive more digitization of their services or their communication channels or whatever was relevant to their type of business. So that was already happening. Organizations were looking at inefficiencies in the way that they delivered services and determining where they could use technology to break through those inefficiencies and create a better environment for them. And what that meant is that they were looking at their staffing levels and determining where they had to allocate staff as they began to shift services to more self-service channels. They needed to allocate staff to different types of activities within the organization, especially those that had to do with building deeper relationships with their customers. And as we go through this section of the survey, we're going to look at that a little bit more closely. So like other organizations, financial institutions were thinking about this digital personal services balance within their organization. What do I deliver from a back office perspective that gains me efficiencies and improves the expense side of my organizations? And what activities are most important to my frontline staff that are dealing with their customers on a daily basis, and how can I create better value out of that? In addition, human resources were looking at talent management then in a different way. How do we nurture career paths that are more defined along these lines of business? And how does that intersect with my self-service strategies? But what's most important about this that I want to continue to emphasize is the fact that, again, in a small and medium-sized enterprise, that culture of personality, that culture of personal service, of relevant service, of understanding your customers' personas and reacting to those, that empathy that you mentioned, Lydia, is so important to their differentiator in the market. And so if that is my core value proposition, is that I can marry these things together. So back before the pandemic, hybrid working meant the combination of digital and in-person environment. And that's what, when we talked about hybrid, that's really what we meant. But what that translated into the fact that there were no remote work policies, because remote work was not relevant to what they did on a daily basis. It was that interpersonal connection that was relevant. It were those things that were most important to them. And so as they thought about talent management and how do I attract and retain the kind of talent that I need, they understood that they needed to begin to bring workers into these organizations that understood this dynamic between digital and physical interactions. And I think that's where we see, and Ben is putting up a slide now with some interesting data about that. Ben, do you want to share a little bit of what we've seen about that disconnect?
Well, the interesting thing is, as you see here, right, it's, banks, but I think a lot of organizations will find that they had a challenge retaining younger talent, but they also understood the importance of it, but they didn't have a specific strategy for it. And the reason why I think this is so insightful is because not only from my own work when I was leading teams on the corporate side, but also in my coaching work now with millennials and Gen Zs, it's, as well as what's a lot's been reported, is their values as a generation are typically really well aligned with the community and mission focused that many SMEs have and what they represent. And so there's actually a real opportunity to create a really tight connection in attracting these generations to these small and medium-sized enterprises. But also too, just the fact that as digital transformation takes hold and was already taking hold, both internally and externally, this generation is really comfortable with technology. And so it can really accelerate not only the opportunity for adoption internally, but how they can work with customers who are also trying to understand how to work with the self-service strategy. So we'll talk more about it later, but I think this is really a critical point that we'll probably continue to hammer home as we go through the findings and what we heard.
What I think is really interesting is that you're almost in lockstep with the changes that are happening in retail, in e-commerce. There's always been a lot of talk about omni-channel and meeting customers where they are. And especially over this last year, I've talked to a number of retailers, particularly those that are direct to consumer, where they've had to increase efficiency because of demand, because there were so many orders coming in. You still want to provide a level of customer service that is integral to the experience. But at the same time, you have to balance that barrage of incoming requests and knowing how to, is somebody just looking for an order? Is somebody just wanting to make a deposit? Is somebody, just needing to find out where something is? which could be handled in an automated fashion versus, you know, sitting down with somebody and saying, okay, I need some recommendations. So I think, yes, as you both have said, the workplace has been in flux. This draw for younger workers is certainly aligned with the change. Tom, I want to come to you though, and you've got the boots on the ground, and as I mentioned before, elbow deep in all of this. So tell me a little bit about what's happening at PSCU and what the structure was before and how that changed.
Sure, Lydia. So it was interesting. So we've got 7 campuses. We're headquartered in St. Petersburg, Florida, about 2,800 employees, and we've got a whole mix of types of employees, from professionals in fintech and product development and finance and accounting, and then a whole host of frontline contact center staff and fraud staff that are servicing credit union members for their needs. Previous to the pandemic, we were roughly 90% of our staff were on site. You know, and my marketing team was even on site almost entirely. Well, in the space of less than a week, we pivoted and sent 90% of the staff home. And the challenge, it was not just equipping all of these folks who maybe didn't have laptops with laptops, right, making sure that everything was secured, because you're dealing with transactions and right, member interactions, and you've got a staff of contact center staff that's always been managed on the ground by supervisors. So how do you monitor all those folks remotely, making sure that they're supporting the members? But then we focused a great deal on communications. Communications was really key for us. We upped that amount of communications across the organization. We increased training. We had to train supervisors on how do you shift from really coaching and leading a staff where you're walking around at cubicles to suddenly being they're all at home, and how do you engage with them in a remote fashion? So we had to adjust all of our training. And what's been amazing is that while we thought we were going to have all of these challenges, after people kind of figured out, where can I work at home? How can I work around my kids or the seniors at home and actually get my work done? We've seen the performance actually improve across the organization as people have been able to, you know, grow in this new environment. And we've been very involved with the Gallup employee engagement work for the last several years. We've been very stagnant for a couple of years in terms of how we were sitting. We did the survey this past fall after we'd been at home for almost a year, again, with all employees, and we actually grew for 5 percentage points above the 90% engagement. So our employees are much more engaged now than they were before in the office. So it's causing us to transform our thought process for, once we get past this, what's this new hybrid environment look like? But it's clearly going to be different.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, I've seen lots of reports about the productivity increasing, but the engagement increasing is a very encouraging metric, I believe, that you know, certainly bodes well for the future if we can just kind of keep the momentum. So we're talking about before and after, but let's talk about like the moment. Patty, what was the moment like in this segment?
Sure, the moment was just shocking, like it was to so many organizations around the country, but it really shows the resiliency and also the capacity for adaptability that we have just simply as human beings. Mm-hmm. You know, in the early days, the most concerning thing, I think, for most organizations was ensuring that their employees were safe, right, that their customers were safe and well cared for, mm-hmm, and that they're, in particular in organizations that have high levels of security required, that security and risk management is in place. And that was certainly true in this case. So those were the really early term concerns of the managers that we spoke to. That was all that. Now, as they moved through the lockdown and realized that this was going to be going on for some time now, this is not just a one-time disaster that might have affected one location or a short shutdown somewhere. This was across the enterprise, no matter how large or small that enterprise was, and it was going to be persistent. So then they began to look at how exactly are we working? Because remember, this is a segment that entered this with no remote work policies of any kind, hadn't even conceived of remote work in this segment at all. And that's why I am confident to say that this is the largest change in this segment. And I think that's true for many others as well that we've seen in quite some time. One of the myths that this busted, and maybe this will be on Mythbusters one of these days, you never know. One of the myths
we hope
that the pandemic, we hope so. One of the myths that the pandemic really busted was that if you work at home, you are not going to be productive. Mm-hmm. If you work at home, you're going to be walking your dog and doing the laundry and helping your kids with the homework. And actually the helping the kids with the homework was going on, but without any loss of productivity. I think Tom mentioned it as well. So one of the real unexpected outcomes of this was a couple of things. One was that productivity was accelerated, that they were amazed and very pleased at how productive their staffs really were and how persistently productive. It wasn't just a productivity bump, but as we saw here, yeah, we did see a bump initially, but we are continuing to see much higher levels of productivity. And second, that employees were frankly happier, as Tom mentioned, that they were more satisfied, that it gave them an opportunity to better manage their work-life balance because they were dealing with the impact of the pandemic in many aspects of their lives. And so this was one of the unexpected areas. However, with every opportunity, there's always a challenge as well. And really some of the challenges that organizations face was concern about burnout. You know, how do I make sure that my staff are not being burned out? That took a lot of management energy. Thinking about how do I onboard new employees because we're hiring, right? Our business is still happening while the pandemic's going on. And how do I connect new employees to my culture? Because remember, in these types of organizations, especially in these sizes of organizations, that overriding preservation of culture, of go-to-market, of your value differentiator is everything. That's what you always have to keep your eye on. So how do I onboard my new employees, get them connected to their peers, get them connected to me? How do I identify managers that may be struggling with this, that don't necessarily have expansive communication skills to understand how to do that? So how do I do that? That took up another component of executives thinking around this. How do I align all of these up? And especially when it comes to middle management, where really the rubber hits the road in most organizations, because middle management is responsible for responding to the needs of the larger organization, as well as ensuring that frontline staff are well. And I think, Ben, you had a couple of ideas wanted to chat with our participants here a little bit about that middle management piece. Let's take a pause and let's hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, even before this, and I even remember during my days when senior management would talk about the challenge, the gulf in the middle management and the challenges it created in an organization to help help the organization become more impactful. But that became even more apparent during the pandemic, because it was requiring, as Lydia said earlier, it wasn't just a matter of keeping people focused and keeping the work getting done, but it was also bringing empathy into it. You know, and it is true, right? Middle management is not only do they help inform the strategy that a company is going to deploy, but they're also responsible for executing it. They also typically manage the largest number of employees within the company. So building those soft skills, building coaching skills is really a critical competency that doubling down on really has to occur beyond just simply being managerial. And we'll talk more about that later, but I think that became even more apparent as we had this kind of extended work from home.
Right. So as time went on, right, Ben, as time went on, executives were learning the impact on their workforces, on their management, on their organization. And they were replaying that and reconsidering that as they began to get settled down into what should their policies really look like. And as time went on, they recognized that there was a number of staff members that missed being in the office, that missed being with their colleagues, that had value in it. They found, for example, that they struggled with strategy development and brainstorming sessions or product and service development because it's better in those types of sessions to be together in a room, you know, these whiteboarding sessions. So that became kind of challenging. And so really the unexpected outcomes, and the last item on this key finding are unexpected outcomes. Again, I want to emphasize the fact that unexpected to these organizations were things like that remote work can work and people will be productive at home, and that will happen, that employees will be happy, that they don't necessarily need to be permanently tethered to a central office to find value in the way that they work. And so we saw a lot of trial and error. And one of the key takeaways, I think, really out of this era of the pandemic, if we can speak of it in that way, is the fact that it requires flexibility and the ability to put your learnings into context of your organization, because in these types of hybrid work environments, and now we're moving out of a hybrid work environment that's digital and in person, and now we're moving into a hybrid environment where it's digital, in person, and remote. So we now have three things intersecting that are creating this hybrid work environment, is to be flexible. And there was a lot of trial and error. I'm sure you can attest to this, Tom, where there was a lot of trying things, especially when it came to employee motivation, incentives, rewards programs, trying to understand how do we bring employees back together, get them all on the same page, celebrate our successes and other things in ways that we really haven't had to think about that in the past.
I think that that's all part of the engagement that is particularly with regards to recognition. I mean, I've heard several HR directors say that they've now taken on the hat of chief counselor to, you know, lend the empathetic ear. And I'm also thinking about what you said, Ben, about middle managers, because a lot of those people have the younger professionals, individual contributors who really don't have a long history of working. And now all of a sudden you're disconnected from the people who could teach you things or learn by osmosis in the office. Right. So yes, there has been a lot of trial and error I've seen, not just in the financial segment. But Tom, you're starting to see some results of these trial and error experiments, particularly I think with regards to recruiting, you said?
Yeah, it's really a double-edged sword you got to think about, Lydia, in terms of retention and recruiting. So on the positive side, where before, as we were looking at, for example, our Tampa Bay market, and we're trying to draw in staff to work on our campus there. Well, now that we can basically engage with folks on a work from home basis, you know, it opens up that landscape to be able to bring in staff from anywhere in the country because of this environment. And that's been good in many departments. That we've actually brought back some staff that had to leave because their spouses had moved, they moved along with them, and then been able to rejoin the organization in different capacities. But on the other side, you got to think about the fact that not only is it on the positive side, but also all of your staff can be easily poached by anyone across the country as well. So as you think about that environment you're trying to create for the long term, and we're still, 90% remote now and kind of planning for that trip back in the office. And most of our departments are going to be in a situation of hybrid, where they're not going to require their staffs where before they would have been in the office, 4 or 5 days a week. It might be 1 or 2. And that's going to be, because that's what we're competing with for these folks that have really started to enjoy and be productive and be engaged in this work from home environment. They don't want to leave that. So how do you think about the long term, which is what we're doing, to make sure that we have a holistic group that's able to get together when we need to, and yet work productively at home and balance that?
Ben, I thought you might want to pull the lens back and give us a broader picture of this recruiting and retention experiment.
Yeah, look, building on what Tom said, and I think Tom even said that this Gartner survey, there's something that's even more impactful about this, but I think he's really raising an important point. the work that I do, especially with tech companies, what's interesting is most tech companies, whether they're large or small, are going to either stay fully remote if employees want to, or fully flexible. And the only reason I'm focusing on tech companies, when you think especially about those, right, and you think about what Patty was talking about with respect to digital transformation, and you think about it in the context of where are you going to need skilled workers, it's going to be more on the technology side, right? And so if you're thinking about how we're going to continue to be able to compete in that space or to find the efficiencies that come from that, how are you going to compete for resources or retain the resources you have if these other tech companies are enabling that? You know, Salesforce.com is really actually is a great example of that, where they've widely published their work from anywhere program and for employees. And that's just one that does that. So that really creates a potential risk. But as Tom said, and we also heard from the other survey participants, is that they also see this as an opportunity if they're willing to open their minds up to that level of flexibility. And I think that's really the key.
So, Patty, based on some of the feedback that you heard from the people who were surveyed, how are they thinking about the future from a practical, strategic standpoint?
Well, you know, in many cases, the pandemic really acted as an accelerant in a market that moves very slowly, but it demanded that they change and change rapidly. And that's really what they're responding to. So this quote that we grab, which is "this will push us to innovate faster," I think really encapsulates future planning. As we mentioned, one of the amazing opportunities is the opportunity for thinking about staffing more broadly, to really take a look at. I have an opportunity to attract staff at various skill levels from around the country, because I'm not going to require that they relocate. Of course, there's the downside to that, which is that your employees, especially your managers, may see a career path that they hadn't envisioned as well. But that all has to do with retention. And so what we saw in investments in retention is, how do we create and nurture career paths that align our staff well to the skills that they have, so that they can create value for their staff and value for the organization. So that strategic planning around workforce management has taken on a whole new look now that they have the opportunity to gain staff from wherever they need to gain them. And also, how do they create these career paths that ensure that these individuals are going to have a long-standing career with the organizations that they want to work with? Here we go, strategic planning, workforce management. The other key activity that's going on is
a good driver.
is remote. I learned to drive in New York,
he
so
took his feet off
totally
both of the
it.
pedals.
The other piece is remote work enablement. And there is a nuts and bolts aspect to just remote work enablement, especially if you're an industry that might be regulated, because you do have compliance around that.
Sure.
And so there are definitely investments in not just the work itself, but also that human resource piece of that. How do we create training programs that can be distributed, for example? We talked about our retention and motivation. How do we create an environment where our employees feel motivated and feel valued? And that all has to be done in both a virtual and an in-person environment. We only talked to one participant in our survey that was 100% on-site work. Every single other one indicated they will all be doing some type of remote, a combination of remote and on-site work. In some cases using hoteling and hoteling strategies to manage office space better. In other cases, they were going to prescribe when employees had to begin, in some cases not. So again, the context, there is no right answer here. It's really contextual to the organization that you might be in. Another component of future planning is questioning the future, which I think it's incumbent on executives to be skeptical. you know, how long will we be returning to primarily in-person work anytime soon? How long will this be sustained? And they think about that. But I can tell you, I didn't feel like that took a lot of thought process in most cases. Of course, it's in the back of their mind that that may happen. And I think it's prudent to always kind of have a plan A and a plan B. But in this case, there's no question in my mind that this hybrid, and again, I'd say it's a hybrid between digital services, in-person services, and remote work. Mm-hmm. How does this all come together, and how do we create a sustainable model that aligns well with our strategic focus and objectives? So the whole idea is, how do we line up our workforce, our executive management team, our middle management team, our frontline staff, and our customers, to approach our customers in a way that creates the most value for our organization and meets our strategic objectives. So that was some of the future planning that we found was really going on in these organizations. Ben, did you want to add to
that? He's good. He's keeping his feet on the pedals this time.
Okay, there we go.
No, Tom, I actually wanted to hear from, because you know, you sort of are touching on, for example, bringing people back into the organization. So that's a recruitment effort. But can you just kind of dive into the nuts and bolts of what day-to-day is going to look like there? Who's making the decisions? I mean, is it going to be like on a team-by-team basis, location by location? How is that all going to work?
Great question, Lydia. So I'll touch on a couple of things. So we're leaving it up to our my peers like myself that run various businesses in terms of how they're going to bring their teams back on campus. Some have decided that they've been so productive on a remote basis that they're going to be primarily remote. Our product team that used to be on campus a lot is going to be remote unless they're coming in for collaboration efforts and planning days with the technology team. We have some other areas of the business that'll probably be back in with more folks on campus. But Patty mentioned hoteling software, so we have invested in that, and we're putting certain areas of our campuses under that type of hoteling management, which will allow folks to kind of plan, if they're going to come in the office 1 or 2 days a week, which days do I commit? If I want to work and collaborate with Patty in another department or Ben in another department, I can see if they're going to be in on those days to make my time at campus more effective. So we think it's going to be a great tool for us to use. But then another aspect we're trying to plan for is we're trying to give this flexibility. Is part of the success of PSU has been showcasing our special culture to the credit unions we serve. So we oftentimes will have credit unions coming to visit us on campus to see presentations and get a feel for the culture. Mm-hmm. We need to make sure we have enough staff on campus so that when we are giving them the tours and walking around, they're not just seeing empty desks. So how do we have that balance between seeing the PSU team in action, but allowing the flexibility? So it's going to be a work in progress, but we're trying to think of all of those aspects to make sure we preserve our culture and create that flexibility for all of our team members so that they're effective for the long term.
Yeah, I think that it's a logistical challenge that no one thought that they would have to plan for. Is what does the office look like? Let's say, you know, I'm probably thinking most people are going to go in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, leave Monday and Friday for working remotely. So what happens on Monday and Friday? Is it a ghost town? Like, how do you sort of encourage engagement? I'm just spitballing here. No one has the answers to these questions yet. We're just going to have to fly by the seat of our pants. But Ben, do you have any other thoughts about how this is all going to, you know, how to think about this in the coming months?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what Tom said, right, and what we've been talking about all along, right, which is what are the 3 drivers to sustain the organizational culture that's so critical to you? And in the context that is about retaining the culture by, you know, identifying or adopting a remote first mindset. And what I mean by that is time and flexibility can actually become a new currency. There was a recent study, I forget the source off the top of my head, but it's in the white paper that we can share with everybody afterwards. Nearly half of Gen Z and millennials said that they would actually give up 10% of future earnings for greater flexibility around work arrangements, right? But also the other part of retaining culture is that, leaders decide and they set and steer the culture, right? It's more than just the values and piece of paper it's written on. It's really driven from that. If there was a benefit or a value from COVID, part of it was working from home added a layer of what I'd call humanization and connection for leaders to their teams. So in a hybrid situation going forward, what could that look like? It might look like that instead of people who are in the office sitting in the conference room, so that the people who have chosen to work from home are on the Zoom, that everyone still Zooms in from their office, as an example. So some small things that you can do to continue to maintain that connection and feel like that there's no penalty for whatever decision that you've made that works best for you. When we think about reskilling, reframing connections, and when I talked about reskilling to address the new normal, what I mean by that is how do you integrate both emotional, social, and adaptability skills, not to mention digital and cognitive skills into your training strategies, right? Or how do you start to deploy a program like what I've called Manager's Coach, right? Where you enable managers to bring a more individualized dimension to their team leadership. I've done this with clients. It's another way to bring coaching deeper into the organization, right? And we all know the impacts beyond just traditional coaching, which isn't always available. And when you think about rethinking retention, it's both upskilling for redeployment, but it's also the added flexibility. Tom talked a lot about the added flexibility in that context, but just to even support it, there was another survey that showed that 33% of millennials and Gen Zs said that they would give up future earnings for the types of benefits that might include flexible work time or corporate volunteering. So again, it's just a demonstration of how their values are so completely different, but how they can be so well aligned. But when you think about upskilling, especially in the context of technology, if you're taking employees, say, out of other areas, it's not just making them programmers and engineers, but it can be things like user experience. It can be things like project management offices within technology organizations. It can be, business IT partners or vendor management. So what are some of the functional roles there? But the most important thing to that, right? A lot of people will deploy these reskilling programs, but the most important thing is how do you identify those employees who are most likely want that type of a role or opportunity or have the skills? And there's ways to do that. For a lot of the people in this audience probably have heard of it. There's a Hogan assessment as an example that actually looks at it's an evidence-based tool that actually looks at your drivers and what's motivating for you, but it also looks at some of your innate skills. And it's really easy to identify those innate behaviors and skills that are aligned to those types of roles. So the idea is first find the people who really would be successful there so that you're not only not setting them up for failure unintentionally, but also then what does that training look like? But more importantly, once the training's done, how do you give them a year of kind of mentoring and coaching to ensure that their transition is really successful? So those are just some examples of how you can refine and build on what Tom was saying about what you can do in the new normal as return to work happens.
And I think another thing, if I can just add to that real quick, I think another component of this is to ensure that first of all, you're thinking through some policies that are defensible and are fair and balanced. I think in most cases, staff members will even if they may not agree with a policy, if they believe that it is being done in a fair and balanced manner, then they will accept it. They may not agree with it, but they will accept it. And that's one of the things we found in talking to the executives that we talked to, is that deriving policies that were fair and balanced were very important.
Well, and I also think that in terms of professional development, if you're providing a thoughtful and balanced approach to who gets that training and development, it really makes everybody feel good about it, because I often hear about the hypos and how they're always singled out. But what about those people functioning solidly in the middle that could benefit from training, reskilling, upskilling, whatever we want to call it these days? And the effect that has on retention, I'm sure, is significant.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's why I like this idea of leveling the playing field through some sort of a assessment that's evidence-based, so that everyone has a fair chance to be evaluated, and not just the high post. Or in a lot of the diversity I work, we do. How do you mitigate cloning or unconscious bias in those decisions?
Sure.
So exactly right, Lydia.
Well, we are bumping up to just about 10 minutes before we finish here. So we do have some questions from the audience, some good ones here. Here's one. Have you observed some of the reasons that certain employees really don't want to return to the office, like lack of privacy or flexibility during the workday? And how do we address that?
I can tell you, in a lot of the coaching work I do, interestingly, and I love that it's supported by what I've also been reading, is that a lot while they're missing the personal connection that can occur in the office, they're seeing the disconnection that the commute creates. And so, I think that finding that balance, or understanding how that can work, I think is really critical. The other thing, building on that too, is ensuring that if you're creating a policy like that, how do you ensure that those who do decide to work from home or stay in a hybrid mode don't then get overlooked unintentionally for promotions or other opportunities as well?
Tom, did you want to add some thoughts there about keeping things fair?
Sure. So, I mean, we've really looked at it across our teams, and again, we're still in the early stages of coming back. So it's not been a button we've had to push yet, but the discussions we've had are, is the employee performing? If they're performing at a level that is at or exceeding expectations, then we should let them work in an environment that's most effective for them. If they're not performing and they require, that they would be a better performer if we have a more controlled environment within one of our office spaces, we'll nudge them that way. So it's really going to be based on their performance and how they're really working with their manager and having more flexibility from that standpoint.
Okay. We have another. In a suddenly expanding economy, we're hearing that skilled employees are really in the driver's seat in the relationship with employers. How should employers think about that shift in the power dynamic? So kind of like in real estate, where it's a buyer's market, now it's an employee's market. What wisdom
Well, it's
do
interesting. We happened to be in the midst, while this was going on, we're actually in the middle of a kind of a job analysis across the organization. So our HR team kind of had foresight as we were getting the pandemic about what this new world might look like. So we had been doing a whole job architecture analysis and grading and looking at not just compensation levels we're competing with in the markets where we might be operating, but across the country, so that we know that if someone might be lured to work for a company in New York or San Francisco because the pay scale is a little bit different, how do we compete with that if we're in St. Petersburg or Detroit, Michigan, and so forth? So that's a process we've been going through, knowing that our more highly skilled employees are going to be sought after.
And I also heard that for those organizations that are allowing people to be remote, for just live anywhere and continue to do their work remotely, that there's going to be a change in their comp packages because of where they might be living. So let's say if they were in the Bay Area and they're moving to the middle states, they're going to take a drop in their salary because the cost of living is lower. I don't really know where to think about that. I don't know that that's a fair thing to do, or what are you all hearing, Ben?
Well, yeah, I would build on that, or what I've also experienced in my past life, but also in what I'm also hearing now is, or they may allow them to maintain the salaries that they have, but then the adjustments that they might normally get will not keep pace because they're in a lower cost market. So you're right. It's just, there's a lot of different approaches, but I think fairness and even arguably some, local law has to be considered when you look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there is,
and then you've got to think about when you bring people back together. If let's say you do have employees that move away, and you do need to have a team meeting, Do you pay for their travel back to the home base because they're now remote? So those are some of the discussions you have to have as an organization.
Great point.
Yeah, and again, it's all a grand experiment, isn't it? We have another question here. What are the best tools or means of approach for employees to approach their supervisors with a request for a hybrid schedule?
Tom, I'd love for you, as sitting in your seat right now, to explain how you would see someone making that case to you.
So I was one before the whole pandemic that was convinced that my staff had to be in person. You know, I was doing an overhaul of my team to upgrade them. I joined the company 3 years ago and had a low performing team. And I was convinced that unless we were all together, or at least 90% of us, I was totally against work from home. I mean, I would allow folks to work from maybe 1 day a week. And I had, you know, now that we've gone through the mix, and even probably 6 months into the pandemic, I still had a view that as we got back in the office, we were going to be probably 3 days a week or 4 days a week. And now I'm to the point where I've had folks, some of my key staffers are relocated because of the housing market, and have talked to me about, I can do this and come in once every 2 weeks. And because I've seen the productivity and they've shown me how they're going to perform, I'm saying yes. So it's really about, you know, can you have that conversation with your manager and make the case for how you will perform, but still have some flexibility. If there is a need to have a team meeting, that I'm willing to travel in for it, or I'm willing to be there. So it's got to be a bit of a balance. It can't just be all what I want to do. How do I want to work to make the company the most effective?
This also just really quickly builds on my, you know, there's silent attrition. So you also don't want in a situation where employees who are afraid to ask won't ask and will move on, even though they may be good performers. And that's why I was talking about the importance of creating kind of coaching skills for your middle managers. You know, part of when I teach coaching skills, or I teach leaders on coaching, or, you know, and some of the skills, part of it's listening, right? And so the point to that is, how can you ensure that managers are creating the environment that enables that kind of conversation to go on? Because otherwise you risk the silent attrition.
100%. Yeah, and I think that I think, you know, just to build on what Ben said, I think our findings in this survey clearly show that they recognize the fact that there was a lot of training that had to be done, retraining in management, just to understand how to balance all of what we've been speaking about now. How to have these conversations with employees, how to identify employees that may be ready to silently attrite from our organizations. You know, this requires a lot of reskilling and retraining at the managerial levels as well.
I think we have time for one more. Susie has asked a few questions, but I'm going to pull out the meat of one of them because it kind of speaks to the flip side of what we're talking about now. We're to start down the path of allowing employees to work from home, hybrid, full-time. Then what happens if work output decreases? Do you bring them into the office full-time to monitor? Hard to convince older thinking mindsets of remote work when culture was prior to COVID needed to be in the office. So Tom, this was kind of where you were sitting originally and changed your mind. But what if somebody isn't performing?
If they're not performing, it's really, they'll have to be managed out. I hate to say that, you know, if they're not going to perform in this remote environment, or they're going to have to come in and be managed. And it requires also the manager to be there too. So there's got to be a commitment then. If I'm seeing an employee is not performing, I'm a manager and I want to work from home too, I've got to make a commitment that I'm going to be there 3 days a week to monitor and coach them and bring them along. So it's got to be a balance on that front, but you may have to make a decision at some point if that performance just isn't going to get there, to make a decision to go a different direction. So,
just the way you would if you were in the office. Well, good people, this is our time. Tom, Patty, Ben, thank you so much for spending the time with me. I would love to revisit this in 6 months and see where we're at.
Sounds great.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lydia, and our wonderful speakers, Patty, Tom, Ben. The three of you really brought a three-part harmony of research, management experience, and coaching insights. So it was a great conversation. And important to focus on small and medium-sized business because they're such a huge part of our economy. Thanks again to our sponsor, Coaching Works NYC, and to all of you who participated today. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and check out more of our upcoming webinars. I'll mention just two. This Thursday, May 27, increasing engagement by building motivation into the work. And on Thursday, June 3rd, how to get recognition right in a COVID-era workplace. Thanks, everyone, and stay well.
Thank you.